In 1863, Her Majesty Queen Victoria came face to face with some of her Māori subjects. 16 Māori entertainers on tour in Britain were invited for an audience. The Queen recorded the historic encounter in her diary.
I went into the council room. There were the 13 chiefs and the 3 women. All had fine eyes and beautiful glossy black hair. I expressed my interest in their welfare, sorrow at the war having broken out, and my satisfaction at seeing them. When asked if they had anything to say, one spoke of their lands being taken away and hoped I would promise that this should not be done, which I said I would.
3 days earlier, on 12 July 1863, the Queen's soldiers had invaded the Waikato. The Taranaki War of 1860 and 1861 had been an attempt to cripple Māori autonomy by local example, to cut off the hand of Māori independence. It had failed. The strategists in Government House Auckland became increasingly convinced that it was the King movement which had frustrated them in Taranaki. The movement in its Waikato heartland was the spine of Māori independence. It could only be broken by direct assault. The imperial government itself did not believe that it had won the Taranaki War. But it did know that the war had cost millions, and it was not keen on another expensive conflict. It therefore sacked Governor Gore Brown, who wanted to renew the fighting, and replaced him with George Grey. George Grey arrived at Auckland for what was in effect his second governorship in September of 1861. His arrival was greeted with delight by the small but vocal Settler Peace Party. Like the London government, they believed that George Grey was the man to bring peace to New Zealand. Others were not so sure. Grey was a different man when he returned for his second term, more bitter and withdrawn. He'd caught his wife Eliza flirting with a naval officer, and though a philanderer himself, his pride was deeply wounded. He did not speak to her again for 36 years, a trifle harsh even for the days of the double standard. Grey had changed in 8 years, and so had New Zealand. There was now a settler cabinet. Grey had to share power with Premier and poet Alfred de Met, and with the new commander of the British Army, General Duncan Cameron, a strong-willed and able Scotsman. Grey was now only one great man amongst several. He was no longer in sole charge. But he continued to maximise his influence by keeping his secrets. No one, neither historians today nor Grey's London masters at the time, knew what was going on here in Government House Auckland. But one thing was certain: Grey did not like sharing power, and he liked sharing it least of all with those he saw as misguided children, the Māori. But there was nothing childlike about these men. The second Māori king, Tawhiao, became a great spiritual leader of his people. His supporters, Wiremu Tamihana and Rewi Maniapoto, were men who impressed even their enemies. At first it seemed Grey sought peace. He suspended Gore Brown's Waikato invasion plans and told the King movement that he would not attack it, but dig around it until it fell of its own accord. Secretly, Grey decided to liquidate the Taranaki liability so he could concentrate on the Waikato. He offered to hand back the Waitara, whose seizure had triggered the Taranaki War. In return, Māori would allow him to reoccupy settler land, which they'd taken as hostage for the Waitara. British troops reoccupied the settler land as agreed, but Grey delayed his side of the bargain while trying to persuade de Met to share responsibility for the deal. Māori thought he had reneged on his promise and ambushed and killed 9 British soldiers at Oakura on the 4th of May. The British retaliated by crushing a small Māori party at Katikara a month later. But Grey took the sting out of Taranaki resistance by returning the Waitara anyway. Low-key skirmishes continued in Taranaki, but Grey was able to move most of his troops to the Waikato. He had been preparing for his invasion since the beginning of 1862, with a massive military build-up in Auckland. A supply organisation, forts and depots, a flotilla of armed and armoured steamers and barges for the control of the Waikato River. He also installed one of the first telegraph lines in New Zealand for rapid communication. The centrepiece of his strategy was a road from Auckland to the Waikato, the Great South Road, designed to take troops and supplies to the new military headquarters at Pōkeno and beyond to the Waikato River. During 1862, the Great South Road inched onward towards the Waikato River, every metre laboriously constructed by the British Army. By early 1863, the road pointed like a giant sword at the heart of the King movement. For the Imperial troops carving a highway through the scrub and swamp of South Auckland, it was back-breaking work. There were few home comforts, and they did not remember Pōkeno fondly.
But tell me, my friends, will this Pōkeno camp, with its mud and its Maoris, its mould and its damp, its general comforts and hardships heartbreaking, its scanty-filled larder and blasted road-making, will this Pōkeno ever make memory smile? No, memory will swamp it in oceans of bile.
The hard-won road linked Auckland with the Waikato River and with the fleet of steam-powered riverboats Grey had brought in. These boats were armoured and armed with cannon and mortars, and they could forge their way upriver against the current. It was this steam technology which enabled British power to probe deep into the very heart of the North Island. The Auckland settlers watched with approval as Grey massed his weapons of war. But as the months wore on, they began to fear that he was not going to use them.
Whatever the policy of Governor Grey may be, it is at all events a very silent policy. It is not known what he intends to do.
Grey told the Imperial government that all his preparations for invasion were purely defensive, made necessary by a terrible Māori conspiracy to attack Auckland. He forwarded evidence of this conspiracy to London. Among the evidence was a story told by a Māori named whare, or house, to a European ship captain in the cabin of the ship over several bottles of rum. Whare alleged that all the leading chiefs of Kingitanga had got together and formulated a plot to attack Auckland and slaughter the civilian population. A road had already been built through the bush for the purpose, and it was not only the Kingitanga leaders that were involved, but also virtually every French missionary in the country. The plan was to attack Auckland by surprise, eliminate or drive off the British settlers, but ensure that the French settlers were left alone because they'd have the secret mark on the door, which would lead the Māori warriors to leave them alone. The conversation is recorded as having lasted from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m, and as you can imagine, a good time was had by all. Grey also made other allegations about Māori plots to attack Auckland, and some were more convincing than the whare story. But we now know that all were almost certainly false. London did not know that they were false. It sent Grey enough ships and troops to transform New Zealand history. Troops came to New Zealand from the four corners of the earth. By 1864, the number of Imperial soldiers approached 12,000. The settler government also provided its own army to supplement the Imperials. Some 5,000 men, half of them from Australia, were recruited for the Waikato militia. In Auckland, 3,000 more militia were called out for active service. During 1863 and 1864, these thousands of soldiers and the hundreds of thousands of pounds flowing in to pay and supply them transformed Auckland. A small, ramshackle settlement of about 8,000 people became a bustling war town. The population doubled, shipping tripled, imports quadrupled. Business boomed, and so did crime, drinking and prostitution. Like other New Zealand towns, Auckland discovered that the troops were heroes on duty, but villains in their time off.
Up with your shutters and put out your light. The 14th are coming down. And come they did, smashing windows and everything else which came in their way.
We tend to think of the New Zealand wars as small, but we need to see them in the context of their own time and place. In 1864, a peak of 18,000 troops, imperial and colonial, were mobilised. This army attacked a Māori people who numbered little more than 50,000 men, women and children. It was as though an army of 1 million people had invaded the New Zealand of today. But the Māori of Waikato did not stand alone against Grey's vast army.
Ana te kōrero a tā whiao. A muri ake nei ki te māwiwi teo koutou, hui hui a koutou kia kotahi, a kotahi koutou ka i nau mai ke mātou, mā mātou koutou he manaki.
From virtually all parts of the North Island, warriors marched to support the King movement. Their numbers may have reached 2 or even 3,000, a quite staggering achievement for a traditionally divided tribal people whose war parties normally numbered in hundreds. But the question was, would thousands be enough against Grey's tens of thousands? George Grey began his war on the 11th of July 1863 by demanding that all Māori between Auckland and the Waikato surrender their guns and swear allegiance to Queen Victoria. Next day, Cameron's army crossed this Rubicon, the Mangatawhiri stream. The invasion of the Waikato was on. 5 days later, the first battle was fought at Koheroa, now an hour's drive south of Auckland. Cameron and his advance guard of 550 men attacked and defeated 100 Māori who were in the process of entrenching themselves. 15 Māori were killed, but not before some British soldiers were shaken by their heavy volleys. They refused to advance until General Cameron himself ran in front, urging them to follow. He was recommended for the Victoria Cross, but it was refused on the grounds that a general had no business risking his own life. Koheroa was only a small victory, but it seemed a good start to the British invasion. But then the advance bogged down. 3.5 months later, the giant British war machine had moved only a few miles south of Koheroa. The settlers blamed Cameron for the delay. They claimed that a subordinate had been ordered to be sure and have the men back for tea because the evenings were getting cool. But the delay was really due to Māori's strategy. The first part of the strategy was Meremere, a large modern pa, blocking land access up the Waikato. Cameron could have taken it if he could have concentrated all his troops against it. But the second part of the strategy prevented this. The Kingites mounted an intensive raiding campaign in Cameron's rear. They won some skirmishes, they lost some skirmishes. But they forced Cameron to use his resources to protect settlers and his lines of supply. British redoubts and stockades sprang up like mushrooms all over South Auckland. Each had to be garrisoned and supplied. Supply convoys had to be protected against Māori raiders. This meant that for 3.5 months, Cameron could not concentrate enough troops to attack Meremere. But reinforcements kept pouring in from all over the world. By the end of October, Cameron at last had enough men to both protect South Auckland and move against Meremere. On the 31st of October 1863, iron gunboats, carrying a division of Cameron's army, steamed up the river past Meremere. This division was to attack the pa from the south, while the main force attacked from the north, cracking the pa like a nut. Cameron was using his big military advantage, steam. There was not much the Māori could do about armoured steamships, but they did try. As the steamship Pioneer cruised past Meremere, it met with something completely unexpected. An accurate bombardment by Māori artillery using some old ship's cannon. Cameron's plan teetered on the brink of disaster as the Pioneer was hit at least twice. But the ammunition was makeshift, and although one shot did make it through the side, it lodged harmlessly in a cask of beef in the Pioneer's hold. The Pioneer steamed on, and Cameron closed his nutcracker. Governor Grey came up to be present at the great victory which was to win the war. But the next day, it was found that the pa had been abandoned. Cameron's long-awaited double punch met only empty air. What the Māori had done was trade mere mere for a 3.5-month delay in the invasion. From the British viewpoint, it was a bad bargain, and they knew it.
Mere Mere has been taken. A bloodless victory was achieved. In fact, such news must be humiliating. Every rebel, I believe, has escaped from Mere Mere.
Grey returned disappointed to Auckland. His war machine rolled on. "80 kilometres south of Auckland, on State Highway 1, is Rangiriri, the Angry Heavens. Travellers speed past today without realising that this is the site of one of the most important battles in New Zealand history. It was here that, after the evacuation of Mere Mere, the Kingites made their second attempt at blocking the advance of Cameron's army. On the 20th of November, less than 3 weeks after Mere Mere, Cameron advanced south and attacked Rangiriri. This pa was made entirely of earth, a defensive line of trenches and parapets running from the Waikato River eastwards to Lake Waikato. Its key was the central redoubt. But its defences were incomplete and it lacked manpower. When Cameron attacked, it was defended by just 500 men and a few women. Manpower wasn't a problem for Cameron. He split his men into 2 divisions. 900 attacked overland from the north, and a river force of 300 landed by steamers attacked from the south. The official version of this battle says Cameron's main force took the whole front line of Rangiriri without difficulty and with heavy Māori losses. When the river force landed in the south, some Māori fled through Lake Waikato. The rest was said to have been surrounded in the central redoubt. Late in the afternoon, Cameron launched 3 assaults against this redoubt, all unsuccessful. But early the next day, the 180 Māori in the redoubt surrendered unconditionally. Rangiriri, we are told, was a decisive victory which proved British military superiority. This Pākehā account is clear, concise, and quite generous about Māori courage. The only little problem is, it is not true. The British did not take the entire front line in their first assault. Their main force actually bounced off the part supported by the central redoubt, losing about 40 men killed and wounded. They recoiled towards the river end of the front line and did manage to take that. They then turned left and, joined by the river force, attacked the central redoubt again and again, at least 4 times. But they were repulsed each time with the loss of a further 90 men. As night fell, the British, in their own words, camped on the wet ground, disgusted and disheartened. They had suffered a total of 132 casualties. The Māori were still not surrounded, and during the night, most of them escaped, leaving a strong rearguard. At dawn, the rearguard hoisted a white flag of truce. They may have been out of ammunition, they may have been buying time in the hope of reinforcement, but standing right here in their trenches, I find it very hard to believe that they were trying to surrender unconditionally. And there is both Māori and Pākehā eyewitness evidence that counts against the unconditional surrender story.
At dawn, a native appeared on the parapet showing a white flag and was very much annoyed to find that no white flag was shown on our side. They were all very much surprised when they found that they must give up their arms and be considered as prisoners.
The prisoners strongly affirmed they were not surrounded. Some said the Pākehā always respected the white flag in war in Taranaki, and that it would be better to hoist it and treat. The general arrived, and his first step was to command them to deliver up their arms. Hello, they said. We did not bargain for this. We hoisted the white flag with a view to treating.
Rangariri fell not to British assault or siege, but because of the misunderstanding of a flag of truce. Contrary to legend, the battle was not proof of British military superiority. The problem of the modern pa remained unsolved. Even so, the British had won a substantial victory. They pushed on, up the Waikato. On the 8th of December, General Cameron occupied the Māori King's capital, Ngaruawahia, which had been abandoned. One of his soldiers, Private James Bedell, went even further and occupied the tomb of the late King Potatau. Bedell had once served in the Imperial Army, but was now a member of the Waikato militia. He'd been recruited in Sydney and had a colourful past. Ultimately, he became Mayor of Tauranga.
On my first visit to Ngaruawahia, I had heard so much about the green stones and other precious relics being buried with the late Maori King, I was determined to try and get some of these relics, so I made for the King's tomb. I discovered a small door and into the grave. I did not find anything and left in disgust. On reaching the boat, I found I'd lost my sheath knife. I was very much disappointed.
Ngaruawahia had fallen, and Tamihana now showed some willingness to negotiate a peace. Grey believed that he had won his war.
There can, I think, be no doubt that the neck of this unhappy rebellion is now broken.
But Grey's peace terms, unconditional surrender, were unacceptable to Tamihana.
If the governor follows me here, I shall fight. If not, I shall remain quiet. But if the general goes to Waipa to attack the Ngāti Maniapoto, I shall be there.
In the new year of 1864, the British pushed deeper into the Waikato, following the Waipa fork of the Waikato River towards Ngāti Maniapoto. But going up the Waipa, they were confronted by a great defensive line, stretching from Pātarangi to Piko Piko and Rangiatia. This complex of fortifications, centred on Pātarangi, was probably the largest cluster of modern pa ever built. Its impregnability was obvious to the British.
General Cameron and his officers could scarcely believe that a savage race without any education in military tactics could have designed such a complete system of defense.
The Pātarangi line protected a rich agricultural district centred on Rangiaowhia. This Māori town showed that Europe had no monopoly on progress. It had roads, fences, mills, churches, even a racecourse. At last, Cameron had backed up the Māori against something they could ill afford to lose. But between him and Rangiaowhia lay the Pātarangi line. By February 1864, Cameron had concentrated his forces in front of the Pātarangi line. The line actually consisted of at least 3 massive modern pa. It was quite possibly the most sophisticated set of earthworks to have been built anywhere in the world up to that time, even including the formidable entrenchments of the Crimean War and the American Civil War. Cameron quickly realised that he had no chance of storming it. Instead, he planned to get behind the line by sending a powerful column through the bush to attack the relatively soft target of Rangiaowhia. The idea was that this would prise the Māori army out of their impregnable defences into the open to protect their precious town. Cameron's had a bad press from the history books, but the fact is, this was a very clever plan. Cameron's army attacked and burned Rangiaowhia on the 21st of February. They killed some old people and women in the process. Cameron then withdrew and awaited the Māori response, which he hoped would be open battle. The next day, as anticipated, the Māori left their impregnable fortifications and reoccupied Rangiaowhia. They then advanced to meet Cameron. The climactic battle he wanted seemed imminent. But the Māori refused to play into Cameron's hands. They made the hard decision to sacrifice both Rangiaowhia and the Pātarangi line in order to save their army. After a rearguard action, the Kingites slipped away into Ngāti Maniapoto territory. There, they began building yet more pa. These pa were never attacked, and in the end it was a series of accidents rather than military plans which gave rise to the most famous battle of the New Zealand Wars. Centuries before the New Zealand Wars, a Welsh resistance leader had fought heroically against the early Anglo-Saxons. He became known as King Arthur. After his death, his English enemies adopted his legend, and it became a central motif in English culture. The New Zealand equivalent of this process of borrowing heroes was based here at Ōrākau, the site of Rewi's last stand. The siege of Ōrākau became a symbol, perhaps the symbol, of the New Zealand Wars, the archetypal battle between generous British and heroic but doomed Māori. But far from being typical, Ōrākau was an exceptional Māori strategic blunder. Rewi Maniapoto was one of the great Māori political and military leaders of the 19th century. He himself was far too good a general to want to make the last stand which was to bear his name. Māori from distant parts of the North Island were still coming to support the King movement. After the fall of Taranaki, a party of Tuhoi met Rewi and demanded that he lead them into battle. They had dragged their guns and ammunition all the way from the Urewera and were keen to use them.
Give us Ōrākau as a place to use our guns and ammunition. They are too heavy to carry all this way for nothing.
Rewi was reluctant, but he felt obligated to agree. In late March, he built a pa at Ōrākau. The hastily built pa at Ōrākau had its tactical strengths, and it served its purpose as a challenge to the British simply by being there under their very noses. But in other respects, it was not a well-chosen site. It was so close to the strong British force under General Carey that he could attack it before it was completed. Still more fatal, it could be surrounded. It had no decent route of escape and so transgressed the most fundamental principle of the modern pa system. On the 30th of March, General Carey had news that the Māori were fortifying Ōrākau. He ordered a surprise dawn attack the next day. 1,120 men marched out to take Ōrākau, where Rewi stood with about 300 men and women. The first three British assaults were all repulsed by disciplined volleys fired at Rewi's command. Ōrākau wasn't as weak as it looked, so General Carey called for reinforcements and settled down to besiege the pa. Over the next 3 days, the British noose tightened. On the second day of the siege, more attacks were repulsed. The garrison tossed back British hand grenades before they could explode. But inside the pa, things were getting grimmer and grimmer. Most of the ammunition had been fired away, there was no water, and the people were eating raw kumara to relieve their thirst. By the third day of the siege, the plight of the Māori was obvious to all. Cameron offered them a chance to surrender. Their reply is engraved on New Zealand history.
We will fight onwards! Forever!
Cameron then offered to allow the women and children to leave. Ahumai Te Pairata replied on their behalf.
Ki te mate ngā tāne, me mate anō ngā wahine, me ngā tamariki. If the men are to die, the women and children must die also.
Te tikanga I kōrero ai I tērā kōrero. Me he mea ka puta rātau ngā wahine me ngā tamariki, kai whea rātau tāna. Tana mōhio ka mate rātau. Pai ake, tana mate, tā rātau mate, ngā wahine me ngā tamariki, me ngā tāne tō. Nā koe nei, te tikanga I tū ai ia ki te kōrero, I tērā kōrero. Taku mōhio aha koa wai te wahine, I roto I te whea rohe, koe rā no ngā kōrero.
But the water and ammunition were now finished, and at 3:30 p.m. on the third day of the siege, the whole garrison began a desperate attempt to cut their way out. Even the official British battle diary was impressed.
The enemy suddenly came out of their entrenchments into the open. There was something mysterious in their appearance as they advanced towards the cordon of troops, without fear, without firing a shot or even a single cry being heard, even from the women.
The Maori cut through the British cordon and escaped towards the Puniu River. Balked of their prey, the British mounted a ferocious pursuit in which the cavalry were prominent. Rewi himself led the rearguard.
Continuing our retreat through the swamp, we overtook Wanitere. I said to him, "Don't run, go easily." Farther on, a soldier shot him dead. I cried a farewell to him, then we continued our flight to the Puniu, some of us returning the fire of our pursuers. We shot 2 troopers out of their saddles. A soldier rode in chase of a native named Ngata, but Ngata had by this time taken cover, and having a good view of the soldier, he shot him. We forded the Puniu, and on the south side rested ourselves and collected the survivors. There were 60 of us there, others came in later.
About 80 Maori, including several women and wounded men, were killed by the British at Orakau. The British lost 17 killed, so this was indeed a victory for them. But 80 Maori corpses were a poor second prize to the capture of Rewi Maniapoto and a triumphant end to the Waikato War.
Ka titiro I hui au hi ngā whakahua o ngā kaumātua nei. Kauru mai te whakaro ki roto iau. I roto I oku haererenga, ne? Te mana te ihi te wehi te tapu kei iarata. A hakua kareka hoi put. E whakahua ntia nei. Ko e nei ngā tāngata I ora I puta mai ai mātou, ne. Ka tangi au kia rātou. Engari, me tō rātou ki anō, hakai te pai. Me te tiro koe, ki muri. Ki muri.
After Orakau, the invasion ground to a halt. The British occupied 1 million acres of Kingite territory, and they kept them. At first with strong military garrisons, later with prosperous dairy farms. This permanently weakened the King movement. Grey's giant war machine had won the war on points. But it had not knocked out the King movement. Beyond the Puniu, the movement survived. Battered, weakened, but intact. And it survives to this day, living proof that Grey and Cameron's war aims were not totally achieved.
The Kingitanga has survived for many reasons. I think the most important reason is that the Kingitanga belongs to everybody. It belongs to all the tribes. And when the first king came into being, all the tribes assembled at Pukawa, and not until there was 100% agreement. And even beyond that, did Portatau agree to become the king. And so it isn't a taonga that belongs to Waikato or to Tainui, but rather it belongs to the whole of New Zealand, belongs to all the people. And Waikato is left in a role of guardianship of the Kingitanga.
General Cameron had tried every trick in his book against the Kingites in the Waikato. Riverborne attacks at Meremere, repeated assaults at Rangariri, outflanking at Pātarangi, encirclement at Orakau. But all he had gained were incomplete victories, not the knockout punch he wanted. But in early April 1864, Cameron heard that Māori had built a pa within 3 miles of his garrison at Tauranga on the east coast. He decided that his chance for a knockout punch had come at last. The focus of the war now shifted to Tauranga. In Tauranga, the tribes were divided between neutrals and Kingites. Most of the Kingites had gone to fight in the Waikato, and the port of Tauranga had served as a useful conduit for warriors and supplies to maintain the Māori trench lines during the British invasion. In an attempt to stem this flow of reinforcements, Cameron had sent a small expedition to Tauranga in January 1864. It established a small fortified post at Camp Te Papa. When news of this reached the Tauranga warriors in the Waikato, they returned to defend their homes. The Tauranga war chief was Rawiri Puherake of Taranaki. Puherake was faced with the old problem. His warriors were part-timers fighting full-timers. At some stage, they had to stop fighting and attend to the economic and domestic affairs which sustained their families. Puherake needed the British to attack him before his warriors had to leave the field. So he deliberately goaded them, building first one pa and then another, each closer and closer to the British camp. With no response forthcoming, he issued a direct challenge.
Hearken! A challenge for a fight between us is declared. The day of fighting, Friday, the first day of April.
Puherake spent the next 3 weeks building another pa at Pukahinahina, a mere 3 miles from the British camp at Te Papa. This was the news that convinced Cameron that his best chance of a knockout blow lay at Tauranga. With a port on his very doorstep, he could easily concentrate an overwhelming number of men and guns against Puherake's pa. He quickly began shifting the best of his troops from the Waikato to Tauranga. Among Cameron's soldiers was a young ensign who had recently arrived in Auckland, Spencer Percival Nichols. Like other British soldiers, he was not greatly impressed by his first sight of the town.
There were lots of friendly Maori looking on as we landed. They were very fine men, but seemed rather stupid in look and gait. We afterwards walked about the town to see what was to be seen, which was nothing. But the people were very civil, which is quite contrary to what I've heard of them.
As with many soldiers, Nichols' world revolved around food and boredom. Army food had improved since the Crimean War, and the supply system in New Zealand was good. But it was not enough for Nichols.
I find that I can eat the whole of my rations for breakfast, so I do not know what I shall do when I have to live on them alone.
Nichols arrived too late for Rangariri, and he missed Orakau. He feared he might miss the war entirely, but in April, his regiment was ordered to Tauranga.
We hear there's to be a good deal of fighting at Tauranga, so I suppose I shall see some fun after all.
Another soldier who missed the battles of Orakau and Rangariri was Hene Pore, or Jane Folly. Once an Auckland schoolteacher, she was now a woman warrior.
When the Kingite troubles began, my brother Neri prepared to join them. And I resolved to join him. I carried a light single-barrelled gun and wore cartridge belts, one buckled round my waist and one over the shoulder. I made a large flag for our war party, lettered Aotearoa. I made it out of some maroon silk, which I carried away from our home.
After participating in raids on the British lines of communication, Hene tried to join the garrison of Rangariri.
We were too late for the battle, fortunately for ourselves. We were in a bad way for food, and for 3 weeks we lived almost entirely on water and wild honey.
Eventually her party joined up with Wiremu Tamehana at Peria. There she would read the New Zealand Herald for the Kingite leaders while sitting around the evening campfire. In April, a Ngaitarangi messenger arrived begging for help against the British invasion of Tauranga.
My brother Neri was amongst those eager to fight alongside Ngaitarangi, and I could not but follow him.
So Hene Pore marched for Tauranga to an appointment with General Cameron and Ensign Nichols at Pukahinahina, also known as the Gate Pa. Hene Pore and her comrades brought the garrison of the Gate Pa to about 230. But on the 29th of April, 1864, Puherake and his garrison realised that this was nothing against the British marching out from Camp Te Papa. Puherake had got more than he had bargained for. He had succeeded in provoking a British attack just as he had planned. But instead of Colonel Greer and his few hundred troops, he now faced General Cameron himself, 1,700 crack troops and 17 big guns. The biggest of these guns was an ultra-modern breech-loading Armstrong, throwing shells weighing 110 pounds each. That's 50 kilograms. It was said to be one of the biggest guns ever used anywhere in the 19th century.
Hori Ngātai recorded the garrison's reaction.
When we gaze at those sons of thunder striding forth, can you wonder that the cooked potatoes seem to have lost their sweetness, and many a one of us seem to forget his hunger?
It more or less says what he felt when he wrote these words. Fear at the number of the imperial forces that were coming, and then again, a sort of bravery, I suppose. They're thinking, well, if they're going to come, let's get it over and done with, sort of thing. I know that's the way I'd feel. I'd think, oh well, you're coming, so come ahead and let's get it over and done with.
Rawiri gave orders that all the women should leave the pa. I refused to leave, saying, if my brother stays, then I am his equal. I can use a gun, and I shall stay.
Spencer Nichols was worried that the Māori would make a run for it.
I dare say the brutes will bolt in the night. We're going to blow the pa to the devil. From the outside, it looks the most insignificant place.
On the eve of the battle, a group of Nichols' fellow officers sat down to dinner at the Elms, the mission house in Tauranga. The 9 officers ended their meal with a prayer and sang the hymn, "Abide with Me." On the day of the battle, the British artillery pounded the gate pa from dawn until 4 in the afternoon. The guns moved closer and closer to the pa and fired about 100 shot and shells each. Given the size of the pa and the garrison, the bombardment was one of the heaviest in the history of modern warfare. Per square metre, the gate pa took a heavier pounding than the trenches of the Western Front in the heaviest artillery bombardments of World War I. The British, from General Cameron to Ensign Nichols, were convinced that the garrison had been pulverised. Certainly, the pa looked shattered, and it was very hard to believe that anything other than a few shell-shocked warriors had survived. So, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Cameron sent in his storming parties. At first, the advancing British found the Māori fire quite light, just as one would expect from a pulverised garrison. The stormers made it into the main part of the pa without great difficulty. Once inside, it was a different story.
The breach was very easy to get through, but inside the fire was tremendously hot and the men were falling fast. We could not see the Māori, as they were in pits covered over with rapo, through the roofs of which they put their rifles and fired at one from a distance of 3 yards. Poor young Glover kept calling out, "Will no one help my brother?" Clark and I then lifted Bob Glover up, but we saw it was no good, as he was quite dead from an awful wound in the forehead, from which his brains were hanging out. On turning, I saw very few of our men in the pa, and they were running out as fast as they could, so I thought I would not stay inside to be tomahawked. Such was my first day under fire, and a nice thing it is to begin one's service with a repulse and a knock on the head.
Gate pa was a masterpiece of trench and bunker warfare. Sophisticated anti-artillery bunkers enabled the garrison to survive the heavy bombardment. But it was also a trap, a killing ground into which the British were invited.
You might as well drive a lot of men into a sheep pen as let them assault a place like that.
Of the 9 officers who had dined around the table just 24 hours earlier, 8 lay on the battlefield. This was a bitter defeat for the British. 111 men, 1/3 of their storming party, were either killed or wounded. During the night, the Māori evacuated the pa without loss, taking 100 British rifles with them and leaving an empty pa in exchange. The gate pa was not the end of the war in Taranaki. 6 weeks later, Colonel Greer came across Puhirake and a new force of warriors building another pa at Te Ranga. He stormed the unfinished trenches, killing at least 68 warriors, including Puhirake. In this field, a few kilometres south of Taranaki, lie the remains of the warriors who lost the short but bloody battle of Te Ranga.
Takota mai ngā toki haumi e hui e taiki e.
The British deserve full military credit for Te Ranga, but it only partly compensated for the defeat at Gate Pa. Grey negotiated a compromise peace with Ngāi Tarangi. Like Ōrākau, the Gate Pa had its legend, stemming from the kindest feature of the battle. As the British wounded lay dying, a Māori took them water. For many years, this angel of mercy was said to be a man. In fact, it was Henepore. This charming story is all many people know about the Battle of Gate Pa. As with Māori heroism at Ōrākau, Māori chivalry at the Gate Pa was real. It did happen, it deserves commemoration, and British recognition of it was quite generous. But it also operated to camouflage another important feature of the battle. It was the Gate Pa which finally convinced General Cameron that he had no solution to the problem of the modern pa.
I considered it perfectly useless to undertake operations against a pa without a chance of taking prisoners or inflicting some loss on the enemy. Experience has shown me that it is not generally desirable to attack such positions.
At the Gate Pa, Europe did its very best against a tribal people numbering just 1/8 of its own forces. It fired its full arsenal of high technology at them, and it failed. Māori taught this simple lesson to the warriors of Europe. The bigger the gun, the deeper the hole. Europe failed to learn it. Men like Cameron were very far from stupid, but they found it hard to believe that so-called savages could invent modern trench warfare. And it was a lack of understanding of trench warfare that led millions of men, including 50,000 New Zealanders, to uselessly spill their blood in World War I, attacking the giant Gate Pa known as the Western Front. The lessons of the New Zealand wars, lessons which might have saved some of them, lay forgotten in their own backyard. Oh, yeah.